History likes to polish its monarchs. In paintings, they gleam in silk robes, their skin flawless, their hair immaculate. But behind the gold frames and glowing oil paint, there was often another truth, one far less pleasant to the senses. The courts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East were often clouded in perfumes, not just for beauty, but to mask the suffocating odor of their rulers. In the days before deodorant, toothpaste, or even regular bathing, royal hygiene could be shocking. Bathing was often seen as dangerous, a superstition rooted in the belief that water could weaken the body or invite illness. In some kingdoms, it was thought that a ruler's skin should never be fully exposed, as if cleanliness might somehow wash away divine favor. Instead of soap and water, they relied on heavy oils, flowers, and spices to cover what lingered underneath. For those who served close to them, the result was often unbearable. It was not just bad breath or sweaty clothes. These were rulers who sometimes went months, even years, without a proper bath. Their chambers were thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, and the oils they used to cover it up. Courtiers fainted in hot, airless rooms. Servants developed headaches from the constant haze of musk and myrrh, and yet no one dared to complain openly. The scent of a king or queen was the scent of authority, even if it made you dizzy. Our journey begins in Renaissance France, a land famous for its perfumes. It is here we find one of history's most surprising offenders, King Louis XIV, the Sun King. Known for his glittering court at Versailles, Louis bathed only about twice a year. Doctors warned him that water could cause illness, so he avoided it, relying instead on clouds of perfume to mask the inevitable. His apartments were a mix of exotic fragrance and human odor. Those who stood close enough during court ceremonies often had to take discreet steps back, hiding their reactions behind fans or polite bows. Louis XIV was not alone. Across Europe and beyond, other rulers rivaled and sometimes exceeded his infamy. In some cases, the stench was so severe that it became part of their legend. From Russian emperors to medieval queens, the archives are filled with whispers and eyewitness accounts that tell us just how overpowering royal presence could be, and how it shaped the politics, diplomacy, and daily life of those forced to endure it. But Louis XIV is just the beginning. In the next part, we step into the Tudor court of England, where one of its most famous monarchs had a smell so distinct, visitors from abroad recorded it with disgust. The court of Versailles dazzled the world, gold-framed mirrors, crystal chandeliers, and gardens stretching to the horizon. Everything about it screamed elegance. And at the center of it all stood King Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who defined 17th-century French grandeur. But behind the glittering facade was something the portraits never showed. Louis smelled terrible. It wasn't because he didn't care about appearances. In fact, Louis was obsessed with how he looked. His clothes were works of art, and his wigs were powdered to perfection. But when it came to bathing, Louis followed the advice of the best physicians of his time, and that advice was to avoid water. Doctors warned that bathing could let sickness seep into the skin. So like many nobles of his era, Louis rarely took a proper bath, sometimes only a few times a year. Instead, he relied on perfume, and not just a dab behind the ears. Louis drenched himself and his surroundings in heavy, sweet fragrances. Musk, ambergris, rosewater, and orange blossom filled his chambers, his clothing, and even his wigs. Walking into his presence was like stepping into a dense fog of scent. For a moment, it seemed pleasant, until you realized what it was hiding. Underneath the perfume lay the odor of an unwashed body. Days of sweat built up under layers of velvet and brocade. His court was hot and crowded, with hundreds of courtiers jostling for position, and the air grew thick. Some visitors reported feeling lightheaded, while others discreetly covered their noses with lace handkerchiefs. The problem didn't stop with his skin. Louis suffered from chronic dental issues, common in an age before modern dentistry, and by his later years, he had lost many teeth. Eating and speaking became difficult, and his breath reportedly added another layer to the sensory assault, but no one dared complain to the king. At Versailles, etiquette was strict, and every movement before the king was choreographed. If the Sun King stepped toward you, you stepped closer in return, no matter how your stomach churned. Ironically, the palace that Louis built to showcase France's sophistication became one of the most notorious hotbeds of odor in Europe. The hallways lacked proper waste disposal, the courtyards were often fouled by chamber pots, and the royal stench mixed with the smell of the palace itself. And yet, Louis's personal smell became part of his identity. To his admirers, it was the scent of royalty, a perfume cloud as much a symbol of his power as his golden throne. To others, it was proof that even the most elegant rulers could not escape the human realities their portraits hid. But Louis XIV was not alone in his odorous reign. Our next royal takes us to England's Tudor court, where the smell did not come from perfume at all, but from a wound so foul it could empty a room. The Tudor court was a place of spectacle, lavish feasts, glittering jewels, and political drama that could turn deadly. At the center of it all stood King Henry VIII, remembered today for his 6 wives, his break from the Catholic Church, and his imposing figure in paintings. But for those who stood in his presence in his later years, one thing overshadowed it all: the stench. In his youth, Henry was the picture of health, tall, athletic, and handsome. But in 1536, everything changed. A jousting accident left him with a severe injury to his leg. The wound never healed. Instead, it developed into an ulcer that constantly reopened and became infected. Without modern medicine, these infections festered, producing a foul-smelling discharge that soaked through his bandages. The odor was so strong that people could smell him from several feet away. Courtiers tried to mask it. His chambers were filled with herbs, flowers, and perfumed cloths. But nothing could fully cover the smell. The air around him carried the sharp, sickly scent of rotting flesh. Those summoned to speak with the king often found themselves struggling to breathe without showing discomfort. On top of this, Henry's teeth were in terrible shape. His love of sugar, a rare luxury in Tudor England, rotted them over the years. By middle age, his mouth was a breeding ground for infection, adding a second layer to the assault on anyone standing close. Chronic halitosis meant that speaking face-to-face with the king could be as unpleasant as it was dangerous. But no one dared mention it. Henry's temper was legendary, and a wrong word could cost you more than your court position. Ambassadors and foreign dignitaries who visited him sometimes hinted at the problem in their letters, referring to the thick air or unhealthy atmosphere of the English court. In truth, they were describing an audience with a king whose very presence could make the strongest stomach turn. The smell also played into the politics of the court. Some petitioners tried to stand farther away, using the elaborate rituals of court etiquette as an excuse. Others brought scented gloves or held perfumed pomanders close to their noses. But there were always moments: a sudden lean forward, a command to approach when escape was impossible. By the final years of his reign, Henry had grown so large and unwell that he could barely move, spending long stretches in bed. Servants attending him worked in shifts, not just because of the king's demands, but because of the oppressive smell that filled the royal chambers. Henry's odor was the result of injury and decay, not neglect. But it was no less legendary. And while he ruled England with an iron fist, there were few who could endure his presence without silently longing for fresh air. From England, our journey takes us north and east, to the icy courts of Russia, where one empress's scent was said to arrive before she did. A cloud of decay that chilled her guests to the bone. The Russian winter could freeze the Neva River solid and turn the streets of St. Petersburg into glittering sheets of ice. But even the biting cold could not mask the odor that seemed to follow Empress Anna Ionovna wherever she went. She ruled from 1730 to 1740, a decade of extravagance, cruelty, and odd court customs. And, according to those who served her, a personal scent so powerful it preceded her arrival. Anna was a towering figure, both physically and politically. She loved spectacle, lavish banquets, and elaborate entertainments. But she had little patience for bathing. Like many of her contemporaries, she believed that water could make one sick, especially in Russia's cold climate. Instead, she relied on scented oils and heavy perfumes, applied in such quantities that they clung to her skin and clothing for days. Unfortunately, Anna also suffered from chronic health issues. Court physicians recorded recurring skin conditions and abscesses, which were treated with poultices and ointments that had their own unpleasant smells. Mixtures of animal fat, herbs, and resin, combined with weak-souled sweat trapped under fur-lined gowns. The result was an odor that no amount of musk could disguise. Visitors often noted in careful diplomatic language that the empress's presence was felt before she entered. What they meant was that you could smell her long before you saw her. At court receptions, attendants sometimes opened windows in the dead of winter just to let fresh air into the gilded halls. The problem was made worse by Anna's love of extravagant clothing. Her gowns were enormous, layered with silks, velvets, and furs, trapping heat and sweat. In a time when laundry was labor-intensive, these garments were not washed regularly. Perfume was sprayed or dabbed onto them repeatedly, mixing with the old scent rather than replacing it. Yet to question the empress's hygiene was unthinkable. Anna was known for her ruthlessness. This was a woman who once forced a courtier to marry his own maid and lived for weeks inside an ice palace as a cruel joke. No one wanted to become the target of her anger over something as personal as her smell. Behind the scenes, servants whispered about her winter musk, a blend of perfume, unwashed fabric, and the sourness of illness. It became part of her legend, another layer in the image of a ruler both feared and gossiped about. While Anna's odor was infamous, she was far from the only ruler in history whose personal scent became a diplomatic challenge. Our next royal takes us to Spain's Golden Age, where a powerful king's refusal to bathe turned his court into one of the smelliest in Europe. The Spanish Empire, under King Philip II, stretched across oceans, its wealth flowing in from the Americas and Asia. He ruled during Spain's Golden Age, overseeing immense power, global trade, and religious influence. Yet for all his authority, Philip carried a personal habit that shocked even his contemporaries. He almost never bathed. Born in 1527, Philip grew up in a royal culture deeply shaped by Catholic piety and medical superstition. Bathing was viewed by many physicians as not only unnecessary but dangerous. Water, they believed, could seep into the body and cause disease. Cleanliness, in their eyes, came from wearing fresh linen against the skin, which would supposedly draw out impurities. Philip embraced this belief to the extreme. He avoided full immersion in water for most of his life, preferring to wipe himself with damp cloths and change into clean shirts several times a day. While this removed some dirt, it did nothing to address the deeper odors that came from an unwashed body. His court chroniclers noted that he often smelled strongly, especially during long audiences or military inspections under the Spanish sun. Philip's diet did not help matters. He favored heavy meats, rich sauces, and strong wine. Without modern dental care, this led to rotting teeth and chronic bad breath. Those who served near him sometimes described in coded phrases the weight of the air in his private chambers. What made matters worse was the heat. Philip spent much of his reign in the Escorial, his grand palace monastery near Madrid, which could become stifling in summer. His thick, ornate robes trapped sweat, and because they were rarely washed, the smell clung to them permanently. Visitors from abroad often brought scented gloves or small pomanders filled with herbs to hold discreetly to their noses during audiences. But no one dared insult the king. Philip was not only the ruler of Spain, he was also the defender of Catholic Europe, a man whose decisions shaped the fate of nations. His courtiers endured the stench in silence, bowing low and keeping their distance when possible. Ironically, Philip's strict avoidance of bathing was seen by some as proof of his discipline and piety. In an age when personal odor was common, his habits were not unusual among the upper classes, but his position meant his smell reached more people than most. And yet, Philip's scent would be nothing compared to our next royal, a French queen whose beauty was legendary, but whose smell was so overpowering that even her lovers struggled to endure it. Queen Isabella of France, often called the she-wolf of France, is remembered as a cunning and politically ruthless figure. She was married to England's King Edward II in the early 14th century. She became infamous for orchestrating his downfall and eventually ruling as regent for her young son, Edward III. But behind the tales of political intrigue lies another, lesser-known detail. Isabella was said to have carried an odor so intense that even those close to her found it hard to bear. Isabella was celebrated for her beauty in her youth. Chroniclers described her as tall, graceful, and commanding in presence. But personal hygiene in her era was rudimentary at best, and Isabella's habits made matters worse. Like many nobles of the medieval period, she rarely bathed, perhaps only a few times a year, fearing illness from water exposure. Instead, she used scented oils and powders, but in modest amounts, not enough to mask the natural buildup of sweat, body odor, and the stale scent of heavy gowns worn repeatedly without washing. Travel between England and France meant long days on horseback or in carriages, often in heat or damp weather. Her clothing, made of thick velvets, furs, and silks, trapped odors and were not laundered often. Servants could air them out, but true cleaning was a rare and laborious task. By the time Isabella arrived for audiences or banquets, her smell was reportedly noticeable. Before she even entered the room, the situation was made worse by her later years, when political tension and stress reportedly took a toll on her health. Some accounts suggest she developed skin issues and abscesses, which would have added a sour medicinal smell from the ointments used to treat them. Even her romantic liaisons were said to be shadowed by her scent, with whispers in court that her beauty did not extend to the air around her. Despite this, Isabella wielded her charm and intelligence with devastating effect. She inspired both fear and admiration, her reputation as a strategist and schemer overshadowing her personal odor in the historical record. But for those who served her directly, maids, attendants, her presence was remembered not just for her piercing eyes and commanding voice, but for the heaviness of the air when she stood close. Her smell became part of her aura, unavoidable, intimidating, and oddly fitting for a queen who ruled not with grace and warmth, but with cold ambition and ruthless resolve. From Isabella's medieval courts, we leap forward in time to another woman of power, an Austrian empress whose elegance masked a secret most never guessed. Her royal scent was enough to make guests faint. Empress Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburg dominions, presided over one of the most powerful empires in 18th century Europe. She was admired for her political skill, her maternal devotion. She bore 16 children, and her commanding presence at court. But behind the grandeur, her attendants knew another truth. Maria Theresa's natural scent was so strong that it became part of her legend, lingering even after she had left a room. Unlike some royals who completely avoided bathing, Maria Theresa did wash, but only occasionally, and never in the full, immersing way we think of today. Bathing in large tubs was still viewed by many physicians as risky, so she preferred partial washes with cloths and warm water. Between these infrequent cleansings, she relied heavily on perfumes and powders, especially lavender, to maintain the illusion of freshness. The problem was that her perfume was never applied to clean skin. Instead, it mixed with the underlying scent of sweat, natural oils, and the faint musk of unwashed fabrics. Over time, the lavender became a signal not of cleanliness, but of a powerful fragrance attempting to mask something far less pleasant. Court life only amplified the problem. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna was a place of constant ceremonies, audiences, and banquets. Maria Theresa wore heavy brocades, silks, and velvets that trapped heat and odor, and these garments were not cleaned after each use. Servants could air them out or dust them with powder, but the scent of the empress, both perfume and body, clung stubbornly. Some diplomats wrote carefully coded descriptions of their encounters with her. They would speak of the oppressive warmth of the imperial audience chamber, or of the intensity of the air. During a long conversation, in private, these were understood to mean that her perfume was overwhelming, and the smell beneath it inescapable. Yet, her power was such that no one dared mention it to her face. Maria Theresa was known for her sharp wit and firm hand in politics. She ruled alongside her husband, then alone after his death. And she steered the empire through war, reform, and economic change. Any courtier foolish enough to complain about her scent risked exile from her favor, or worse. Ironically, the very lavender perfume she favored became a sort of royal signature. When guests caught its heady blend, they knew the empress was near. But for those sensitive to the mix of floral sweetness and human odor, her arrival could be as dizzying as it was inspiring. From the perfume-drenched palaces of Austria, our final story takes us back to France, where one of history's most glamorous queens carried a secret that court gossip never let die. Beneath the jewels and silks, she smelled so strongly that even her lovers recoiled. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution, has gone down in history as a symbol of opulence, towering hairstyles, shimmering gowns, and the infamous, though misattributed phrase, "let them eat cake." But behind her carefully curated image of beauty and refinement was an uncomfortable truth whispered in the corridors of Versailles. The queen smelled so strongly that even the most devoted admirers found it difficult to be near her for long. The cause wasn't neglect. Marie Antoinette was, by 18th century standards, considered unusually attentive to her appearance. She bathed more often than most royals of her time, sometimes several times a month, in perfumed water. But in a palace with poor sanitation, where chamber pots were emptied into hallways and perfumes mingled with rot, even the cleanest courtiers struggled to stay truly fresh. Marie's problem was partly environmental. Versailles reeked. The stench of unwashed bodies, stagnant water, and waste was inescapable. To counter this, the queen drenched herself in perfumes, especially orange blossom, rose, and jasmine. She perfumed not just her body, but her hair, gloves, and clothing. This created a heavy cloud of scent around her that could be intoxicating to some and overpowering to others. Her elaborate gowns, layered with petticoats and corsets, trapped sweat during long hours of dancing, receptions, and theater performances. The fabrics, rarely washed, absorbed, and held onto the mixture of human scent and perfume. Even her towering wigs, built on pads stuffed with wool, sometimes became home to lice and emitted their own faint musk. Lovers and confidants hinted that her fragrance was as much a barrier as a seduction. The perfume was meant to signal refinement, but when applied over the natural smell of skin that had been dressed in the same clothes for days, it could become cloying, even nauseating. Foreign dignitaries visiting her court sometimes noted, in coded diplomatic letters, that the queen's presence filled the air beyond measure. And yet her scent became inseparable from her persona. To her supporters, it was the aroma of luxury, the floral essence of a queen untouched by the hardships of common life. To her critics, it was proof of her excess, a literal cloud of wealth and vanity that separated her from the people she ruled. When the revolution came, the perfumes that once masked the stench of royal life became meaningless. Stripped of her jewels and silks, awaiting execution, Marie Antoinette no longer smelled of roses and orange blossom. But at Versailles, long after she was gone, courtiers claimed they could still imagine the lingering perfume in the gilded halls. And remember, the woman whose scent was as famous as her face. Across centuries and empires, from the icy halls of Russia to the sunlit courts of Spain and the perfumed salons of France, one truth emerges. Smell has always been part of power. For the 7 royals we've explored, their scent, whether born of neglect, superstition, illness, or excess, became as much a part of their legend as their political deeds. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was shaped by science that simply didn't exist in their lifetimes. In medieval and early modern Europe, bathing was often viewed as dangerous. Physicians warned that hot water could open the pores to disease, and many rulers genuinely believed that avoiding immersion was a form of self-preservation. The result was a world where even the most powerful people, dressed in silks, crowned with jewels, surrounded by gold, carried with them the unavoidable, this very human reality of odor. In some cases, like King James VI or Philip II of Spain, the stench was the byproduct of a lifetime of ritual avoidance of water. For others, like Empress Anna of Russia or Maria Theresa of Austria, perfume was used not as an enhancement, but as a shield, one that often mixed with, rather than concealed, the natural smells beneath. Queens like Isabella of France and Marie Antoinette existed in a paradox, celebrated for beauty, yet remembered by intimates for a scent that betrayed the realities of royal life. These were not isolated quirks. Smell was a constant in court politics. Ambassadors and rivals noticed it, lovers endured it, and servants lived with it daily. In an age before deodorant, dry cleaning, and indoor plumbing, scent was inescapable. But for rulers, it was amplified by the heat of their robes, the weight of their jewels, and the never-ending demands of ceremonial life. What is perhaps most striking is how these odors became part of the aura of authority. For some courtiers, the scent of a monarch, whether lavender and sweat or musk and rosewater, was a sign of proximity to power itself. It was intimate, personal, and impossible to counterfeit. The royal smell could intimidate as much as inspire, marking the ruler as someone apart from ordinary humanity. In the end, the legacy of these 7 royals reminds us that history is not only written in ink and stone, but also carried on the air. Behind every portrait of elegance, every tale of political intrigue, there is the unspoken truth that rulers, like all of us, were flesh and blood, and sometimes unforgettable for reasons no historian intended to preserve. Their empires have crumbled, their crowns have been passed down, but the stories linger faint as perfume, sharp as sweat, and as enduring as the memory of their reigns.